Tessa unbuttoned her cotton blouse, her face flushed with a heady cocktail of embarrassment and excitement. The dressing room was literally bustling with movement. Neon-lipped models stepped gracefully through clouds of makeup and perfume, assistants rushed costumes from rack to shoulder, while the floor manager waded through the chaos barking orders like a drill sergeant. Tessa smiled to herself, breathing in the rich scent of red door and adrenaline. Narrowly avoiding a gaggle of dressmakers making for the door, Tessa walked across the room, blouse in hand, looking around for the clothing rack. The rest of the cast had already been zipped into their outfits, mainly miniskirts, camisoles, and designer jeans, ready for the first take. Filming was about to begin. She had to get into costume as well, although this would involve dressing down rather than dressing up. They were making a television commercial for Carmine Knight's lipstick, a relatively upmarket cosmetic with a racy girl fest image. CNL had pulled out all the stops with this advertisement, aiming at a young professional female demographic. Glancing through the doorway, Tessa could see the technical crew running last-minute checks over the video equipment. The set was a fluorescent retro 70s mock-up, soft edges and liquid day-glow colors contrived to suggest a large group house in the burbs. Seemingly imbued with a life of its own, it buzzed with a glaring neon radiance. She hung the blouse over a nearby chair, almost delirious with anticipation. Very soon, she'd be called out to present herself to the camera in her underwear, a girl of barely 17 with flowing platinum blonde hair and liquid blue eyes so deep you could drown in them. Undoing her tiny black mini, she slid the skirt over her slender, tan thighs, then let it drop to the floor, forming a liquid pool at her feet. Her high-cut lace panties were so sheer that they seemed to have been airbrushed onto her body. The tender hues of her flawless, ivory flesh were plainly visible through the gossamer fabric. She suppressed an urge to place a slim hand over her cleavage. This was her first time before the camera, the dressing room was full of strangers, and she felt agonizingly self-conscious. Still, she had no reason to complain. A new life was opening for her. She was going to be a model. Maybe not a star like Elle or Claudia or Naomi, let's face it, Chamberlain Studios were hardly the pret-a-porter, but the thought of being on TV was thrilling nonetheless. Besides, even if she never froze the traffic at Times Square, she would live out a fantasy she'd had since she'd been a little girl. She was utterly breathless, thinking on it now. Small local advertising companies notwithstanding, the commercial would be broadcast via ECN, the East Coast Communications Network. The thought was virtually intoxicating. When she stepped in front of the video cameras, she'd be parading her underwear throughout the entire northeastern region. Which meant that literally millions of people were going to see her in absolutely nothing but her bra and panties. Stepping through the human tide in her flimsy pink undies, Tessa glanced in the mirror, checking her alpine blonde hair and adjusting an errant lock spiraling over her left cheek. She nodded, smiling faintly to herself. The illusion was perfect. So perfect, in fact, that it was no longer an illusion. How long had she been a girl? All her life, how long had she lived as a girl? 6 years, since her 11th birthday in fact, she'd always had a rather feminine appearance with a softness and a fluid grace which simply couldn't be hidden or disguised, regardless of what our society or genetics had to say on the matter. Of course, image was nothing, as the soda commercials had told an entire generation of teenagers back in the 90s. Image alone hadn't made her a woman, nor had the gradual reshaping of her adolescent physique during more than half a decade of endocrine therapy. In the final analysis, such factors were largely irrelevant. Tessa Greenhart had entered the world biologically male, an insignificant Y chromosome carelessly tacked onto the end of her DNA, but events since that moment had confirmed that biology did not equal destiny, at least not for her. Tessa's body had been a template, a blank page on which sex and gender could be written. The essential truth had been inscribed on her flesh in chemical signifiers, albeit apostrophe quite simply, Tess had always been a girl. 3. The commercial was based on the universal belief that pretty young girls fall inevitably out of their clothes as soon as they're left alone together. Tessa had loved the idea as soon as her agent had described it to her: 5 beautiful girls sharing a house in the suburbs, preparing for an evening out on the town. Running from shower to bedroom, borrowing hairdryers and stockings, swapping dresses hand to hand and making up in the mirror, the myriad little things women do before the big night out. Towards the end, the girls are shown in their bedrooms, glossing their lips with carmine nights, while the stereo blares out the girl-powered jingle written especially for the advert. It was the only mention of the product. The rest of the commercial was made up of pretty girls decked out in stilettos and lycra slip dresses as they hurried about brushing their hair and ransacking each other's wardrobes. Tessa had been snared instantly. The treatment was fun, the soundtrack boppy. It was exactly the kind of shoot she'd wanted to do since she started modeling, and, best of all, the script required that she appear in her bra and pants. This had been the major drawing card, as far as Tessa had been concerned. She had to run through the house flaunting her dainties while the Eurocam followed her from the bathroom to the stairway, and thence to her bedroom, where she'd be shown doing girly things, blow-drying her hair, dancing in the mirror and making up her lovely face, exactly what she did at home when she was planning a long evening's nightclubbing. It was completely gratuitous, of course. There was absolutely no reason why she had to film the advertisement in her bare essentials. It was a lipstick commercial, not a lingerie parade. She could just as easily be shown glazing her lips fully clothed. Not every woman makes up in her underwear, regardless of what the majority of men would like to believe. But the undisguised naughtiness of the idea appealed to Tessa. It was as if the part had been written just for her. For it all had to do with DDT. Her mother had explained it to her on several occasions during her frantically careening adolescence. She was the product of a global interaction of nature and science. Her immaculate femininity was a fragile arch spanning human biology and industrial technology, a bridge constructed before she was even born. Her physical development had been influenced in utero by artificial hormones, synthetic estrogens, the scientific journals had called them. Mainly insecticides, their chemistry mimicked the effects of natural female hormones when assimilated into the human reproductive system. The United States, along with most of Europe and the Asia, had been literally inundated with these complex molecules since the middle of the 20th century. Researchers only noted their impact on the biosphere in the 90s, when ecologists began to notice declining male populations amongst certain environmentally sensitive species, mainly frogs and salamanders. Of course, no one was too concerned over the disappearance of a few creepy crawlies at the bottom of the pond, and the effects of the synthetics had been largely ignored. At least until the fertility levels of the West had taken a sudden, and quite significant downturn. Then everybody had become concerned for the well-being of all kinds of creepy crawlies. To say nothing of the rising numbers of sexually ambiguous children being born throughout the industrialized nations. Of which Tessa had been one. 5. Walking to the doorway, Tessa looked out to the set once more. Lights were being dimmed and brightened, remotes tested for white noise. CNL had spent a small fortune on this production. No expense had been spared in terms of design, personnel, and hardware. They were even shooting a portion of the commercial on film, so as to capture the cinema crowd. Things look as busy out there as they do in here, she thought, watching a techie running a white balance on one of the Steadicams. Feeling a light tap on her forearm, she turned and found herself eye to eye with the director's assistant. She was a small, bright-faced woman in a blue pantsuit, carrying a clipboard full of names and publicity stills. Her name tag read Lois. "You're Tessa?" she asked offhand, consulting the clipboard. Her voice was brisk but otherwise pleasant. "Yes, Tessa Greenheart, Chamberlain Studios. And that's what you're wearing for the shoot? The woman inquired, indicating Tessa's flimsy lace scanties. Yes, it is, she replied, putting a hand to her mouth to hide her smile. She could feel a giggle fluttering around the top of her throat, trying to escape. My agent told me to wear my prettiest undies today. Nice choice, Lois remarked, indulging her with an admiring glance, then snapped back to her more businesslike protocol. We're ready to start filming. You ready? Tessa took a deep breath. The others were already filing towards the door, gossiping like schoolgirls out on the town. Tall and leggy and beautiful, they had nothing to feel nervous about. They got to keep their clothes on. I wish, Tessa replied, and the giggle finally escaped. 6 conceived in an environment literally swimming in synthetic estrogens, Tessa had been unique, even amongst the thousands of children born into the twilight light zone between male and female at the end of the 20th century. The reason had been deceptively simple. By the time she turned 6, Tess had voiced her desire to be a girl. In effect, she wanted the right to choose her own gender. While Tessa's story hadn't made the front page of Time, it had caused a small hurricane of controversy amongst the pediatric specialists handling her case. They'd wanted to flood her system with steroids before she entered puberty, adamant that this was the most logical course of treatment. He was a boy, he'd been born with a male organ, tiny though it was, biology dictated that he had followed his chromosomatic destiny. Tessa's wishes were, of course, completely irrelevant. He was a child and he had no idea what he wanted, and certainly, no concept of what was in his best interests. This was precisely how they'd talked, emphasis on the masculine pronouns. They'd rambled on in this manner for some time, employing the authoritative, slightly patronizing tones that medical professionals retained for the ignorant. Yes, his reproductive organs were completely atrophied, they'd never secrete the androgens he'd need to achieve manhood. But while he was incapable of producing his own testosterone, small daily dosages of the male hormone would ensure that he'd progress as God and nature intended. He had to become a man. Tessa's mother, Eva Greenhart, was a sole parent and liberal feminist from way back. She'd been thoroughly unconvinced by these arguments. She'd read enough constructionist theory to know that a child's gender was not automatically determined by her sex. Gender was simply the product of culture and socialization, not an immutable law of physics dictated by anatomy and chromosomes. Besides, why was masculinity considered the only option in this, or any other, case? Was femininity so undesirable? If they could change Tess into a man by boosting H/IR testosterone levels, couldn't they just as simply employ estrogen to transform her into a woman? The endocrinal team had found the suggestion laughable, if not downright criminal, in its naivety. Synthetic estrogens were the cause of Tessa's condition. By what stretch of the imagination did she conclude that the female hormone could be used to treat the boy's pathology? It's time you faced reality, Ms. Greenhart. Your son is suffering from an illness, his development has been arrested by foreign agents, his DNA damaged by toxic chemicals. From a medical perspective, he's no different from a victim of heavy metal poisoning. Basking in the pompous, lilac glow of utter contempt, Eva listened impatient, nodding silence as they dictated her child's future, dismissing her, Tessa's, childish aspirations as totally unimportant. One of them had actually said that in his sexually unresolved state, Tessa was no better than a neutered dog. Putting him on estrogens would produce a sexual anomaly, a mutant neither male nor female, shunted to the periphery of normal human society. Is that how you want your son to go through life? Are those the only choices you're willing to offer him, eunuch or freak? And it had been this one statement, delivered in the offhand tones of complete insensitivity, which had made up Eva Greenhart's mind regarding Tessa's treatment. 7-10 minutes later, Tessa was standing on the set with her face flushed the color of a ripe strawberry. The only girl in the cast to be stripped to her bra and panties, she felt wonderfully vulnerable, her tiny lace remnants covered so little that she felt almost completely naked. The other girls milled around in their minis and high heels, listening to the director's opening spiel. Exhibiting a subtle pink flush from ankle to hairline, she crossed her hands over her pink satin wonder bra in a vain attempt to hide her deep cleavage. It was an impulse she was totally incapable of resisting. The director, the floor manager, and most of the technical crew were men. Worse still, the set didn't appear to be closed. People seemed to be wandering in all the time, and she had immediately become the focus of all the attention of the masculine quarter. She was almost swooning with pleasure. It was strange, she had dreamed of this moment for years, since early high school in fact, but now that she was actually facing a battery of video cameras with her underwear on full display, her embarrassment was almost as vast as her delight. She'd never imagined how much she could actually enjoy being a public spectacle. Anticipation washed over her in a warm, pulsing cascade. Her tummy was tingling with suspense. Any time now, the cameras would start rolling, or blinking, or whatever it was that videocams do, and she'd be told to take her position for the first take. She was being overwhelmed with feelings and sensations, almost all of them drawn directly from childhood experience. This was hardly surprising in itself. She'd been only 12 years old when she had discovered that delicious blend of joy and humiliation which accompanies public exposure. It had taken place during her first year of junior high school. She'd been living as a girl for about 12 months. Tessa and her older sister Zania had been conscripted as flower girls at their cousin's wedding, and her mother had taken them into Chamberlain for the fitting. They'd gone to a bridal store called Something Blue, where the attendants had made an enormous fuss over her, utterly captivated by her long blonde curls and huge cloud blue eyes. Being only 12, and looking about 10, they hadn't bothered taking her into the fitting room, opting simply to undress her in the showroom right down to her underthings. She'd been too surprised to even protest her disrobing. Within seconds, she had climbed out of her jeans and t-shirt and was being led by the hand to the middle of the floor with her white cotton underpants on full display. Tessa had been completely embarrassed. They were treating her like a little girl, standing her on a leather-bound footstool in her bare panties while they took her measurements. She was in high school now, almost a teenager. She didn't walk around in her undies like a 6-year-old. Worse still, her sister wasn't made to bare her panties in public. Zania got to have her fitting in private. Strangely, she had experienced another feeling, hot and bright and skin-tight, a sense of pleasurable vulnerability she'd never known before. It was an emotion for which she had no word, something trembling and deep, poised halfway between bliss and ecstasy. She'd felt utterly and incomparably beautiful, like the princess in the fairy tale. The same feelings of exaltation and arousal coursed through Tessa's thighs and belly while she waited patiently for the filming to begin. She was having difficulty keeping still. She had no idea where to put her hands. Hiding her cleavage left her panties exposed, so much of her body was on exhibition. She'd been standing on the set for nearly 20 minutes while the director held a confab with the assistant and the FM, her embarrassment and sense of dishabille increasing to an intolerable degree. She would have given virtually anything for a brief robe to cover her modesty, but her pleasure at being forced to wait in her BRA and panties was undeniable. Her breasts were straining at their tight satin restraints, throbbing gently at their pert pinkish tips. She looked over to the director's committee. The creativity conference seemed to be going on forever. How long were they going to make her stand here like this, the only girl in the studio stripped to her knickers? It was so unfair. Did they actually think she had nothing better to do than show off her underwear to 100 perfect strangers? She had never enjoyed herself so much. Tessa thought about the script, such as it was, trying to distract herself from her semi-nudity. She'd seen the storyboard that morning, so she had a good idea what she was expected to do. Her first scene is an extreme close-up of her face as she opens the bathroom door, her platinum blonde hair moist and gleaming. Grinning a naughty little girl smile, she looks both ways to make sure no one is watching, then scampers along the passageway, tossing aside her towel to reveal her brassiere and briefs. The camera then follows her on a 100-yard flash through the household. Darting into the living room where one of her roomies is ironing a blouse, she pauses to glance at herself in the mirror over the mantelpiece, before flitting out to the central hallway waving to her friend as she goes. Glancing at Tessa's panty-clad figure, the girl laughs and shakes her head. Heading for the staircase, Tessa passes another one of her flatmates, this one holding an animated discussion on her cell phone, who gives her a friendly slap on the tushy as she rushes up the stairs, damp hair flying. Still grinning wide but eager to hide her undies from public scrutiny, she turns right at the top, dashing through her door with a silvery laugh. Her second scene, which appears later in the commercial, takes place in her bedroom. Dancing before her full-length mirror, brush in one hand, blow dryer in the other, she allows the camera a generous view of her nubile young body, her lean, slender legs and shapely round bottom, her curvaceous hips, tiny, waspish waist and perfectly sculpted breasts. Tessa imagined it would be the best scene of the commercial, a pretty teenaged girl bouncing around in a tight satin bra and pink, gossamer panties, her hair flailing around her broadly smiling face. The sequence ends with Tessa coloring her lips cadmium red with a stick of carmine nights, winking cheekily at the camera. "I knew you were there all along." Tessa? It was Lois, the director's assistant. Evidently, the creativity conference was finally over. "Are you okay? You're looking a little flushed." "Just a touch of backstage nerves," Tessa smiled. "This is my first time before a TV camera." Lois patted her hand sympathetically. "You'll be fine. Come on, the shoot's underway, and you're up first." Butterflies began dancing in Tessa's tummy as she felt herself led by the hand across the set in her lingerie. Her cheeks flared like a pair of Valentine roses, and her heart slammed into overdrive. The time had come, the lights overhead flooded the set with brilliance, cameras were trained and focused. "It's happening," Tessa thought breathlessly.